Let me begin my lesson today with a definition of the word nightmare. Webster says it's an evil spirit formerly thought to oppress people during sleep. And that's because a nightmare is a frightening dream that usually awakens the sleeper. I don't know if you've ever had nightmares. I'm sure I've had some scary dreams in the past. I don't tend to remember. I tend to know that I'm dreaming these days, but I don't really tend to remember a whole lot of the details. I just have flashes, but I'm sure people have experienced a lot of nightmares. And by that same token, the idea then is sort of created into a figurative sense or a metaphor, something such as an experience, a situation, or an object, or even a person having the monstrous character of a nightmare or producing a feeling of anxiety or terror. I'm sure that some of you might have thought that bullies in high school or earlier were nightmares. But this then, I want to kind of launch this into the idea that back in 1984, there was a movie that came out that kind of took this idea to entertainment levels, if you could call horror movies entertainment, but it was called A Nightmare on Elm Street back in 1984. And its basic plot was the monstrous spirit of a slain child murderer seeks revenge by invading the dreams of teenagers whose parents were responsible for his untimely death. A fellow named Wes Craven created and filmed Nightmare on Elm Street. Back in 1984, he had a budget of $1.1 million. I'm sure even back then that was kind of small potatoes. The film was released in November and grossed $57 million worldwide. And it was met with rave critical reviews and considered to be one of the greatest horror films ever made. It spawned a franchise consisting of 6 sequels, a television series, a crossover with Friday the 13th, and various all kinds of merchandise. A remake of the same name was released in 2010, and aside from stunts, polyester, and Alone in the Dark, it was one of the first films produced by New Line Cinema, who by this point mostly distributed films, leading the company to become a successful film studio. Up until 2008, was even nicknamed the house that Freddy built. So Wes Craven built an empire out of his exploitation of the idea of a nightmare for entertainment purposes. So if you've come to this video, you've noticed I've entitled it Nightmare in Susa. And I've kind of played off on that idea of the fact of a nightmare happening in Persia, or the Medes and the Persians Empire, to Esther and Mordecai and the Jews. And so in Esther, she and Mordecai are about to experience their worst fears, a nightmare, the extermination of themselves and the Jews. And it emanates from Susa, the capital city of the Medes and the Persians. Let me kind of bring you up to date historically, just to make sure we are all on the same page of where Esther fits in. And the reason I think that sometimes we need to stop and kind of recount the place of biblical authors in books historically is because the Bible presents us as presents us a God who acts in history. And I think it's important to see that we can find historical events in the Bible that we can locate historically. But Esther and Mordecai and the Jewish people, the reason why they're in Susa is because beginning with the nation of Assyria, who came and took over the 10 northern tribes in about 720 BC, that became their nightmare. And of course, it was a nightmare, though, that was due them because they had split from the 2 southern tribes and had gone off into idolatry and never looked back. And God kept sending prophets like Elijah and Elisha saying, you need to come back. And they said, no, we're not going to. So finally God says, well, if you're not coming back, I've had it. And so here is your nightmare. And the Assyrians came and destroyed them, their country, and carted many of them off into captivity. Then the Babylonians came along and they defeated the Ninevites, the Assyrians at the Battle of at Nineveh, and they took over and they came to the two southern tribes. And even though they had missed being taken into captivity by the Assyrians, they finally got to the point where God said, okay, you guys are not coming back, so I'm going to bring your worst nightmare. And the nightmare for the Israelites, of course, was to be exiled out of the land. The end of Deuteronomy chapter 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30, God sort of lays it out. Listen, I'm taking you into this good land. I want you to be faithful. God didn't expect them to keep each and every single law that was on the books, but he said, I want you to be faithful, but they weren't. And he said, ultimately, your unfaithfulness will get you exiled out of the land. But you see, what's important to the Jews is that the land was the fulfillment of promises God made to Abraham, and they were Abraham's descendants. So now losing the land, that was their worst nightmare. And so then the Babylonians cart many of the leaders of the Jewish people off into Babylon and other places, and became their nightmare. And of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego experienced that nightmare, and so did Daniel. But then, lo and behold, in 539, the Medes and the Persians finally gained power, and they took over in a kind of a bloodless coup and captured the Babylonians and captured the Jews then, and now they became the power in charge. In Esther, the king is Ahasuerus, sometimes known as Xerxes, and he reigned from 486 to 465 BC. He is actually just a little bit before when Ezra and Nehemiah come along, but he is there as part of the narrative in the first part of Ezra, when Ezra recounts the returning of the Jews from Babylon to the land, because that's what the kings of the Medes and the Persians allowed them to do. And they rebuilt the temple and rebuilt Jerusalem and the wall. Now Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, is the fourth king. He's perhaps the richest. He's a very successful military commander. And perhaps that's why he's the richest, is he's conquered other places and other countries. And for that matter, then, he's probably a very egotistical guy. In fact, that's what he seems to be played as. Even though he does the right thing for his queen later on, he does seem to be one who can stroke his ego and get what you want. Esther chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 is where the nightmare begins. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate, said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. And so this nightmare begins with a promotion. And as we're going to see, this could be just another kingdom, just another promotion, just another rich guy with power. But this has some specifics going on. Haman is promoted. Now, we're not told why. Although later on in Esther chapter 5 and verse 11, as Haman is seeking comfort from his family for Mordecai's refusal to bow down to him, it says, Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons and every instance where the king had magnified him and how he had promoted him above the princes and the servants of the king. So Haman and Ahasuerus have history. We're not told specifically why all of a sudden, but it's quite obvious from this that Haman knows how to stroke the king's ego. He knows what to do. And so he is promoted. Now, some scholars that I've read said that this promotion could be taken place over a period of 3 or 4 years, that it wasn't all of a sudden you said, oh. But then again, with this Ahasuerus, you never can tell what he might do. I mean, he wakes in the middle of the night and reads his chronicles and suddenly remembers Mordecai, and then boom. But then again, Mordecai had done something, and now later on he's rewarded for it. And so that's probably what it is with Haman. Haman over time had all kinds of history with the king, and finally one day he said, Haman, I think you're the right kind of guy for this. And so he elevates him. And he elevates him to second in command. Now, of course, this is where Joseph gets elevated to, but Joseph's a good guy. He gets elevated to Potiphar's household to be second in command. And then he goes into prison and he elevates to be second in command there. Only the jailer isn't more. And then he gets elevated to be second in command to Pharaoh. But Haman doesn't have good intentions. He is only interested in himself. And in fact, I think as we read the story, we can find out that he's very ambitious. Ambition can be a good thing. There are lots of folks I know that they get into their careers, they get into a field of study, or they become a minister and they kind of get ambitious. They want to get ahead. And so they sort of plot their course. Here's where I want to end up, and so here's what I need to do. And so they go about fulfilling their dreams, not their nightmares, in trying to get ahead. And that's what ambition can be about. But unfortunately, Haman's ambition is not very good. Haman's ambition is such that it's going to hurt people. And we know he's ambitious because later on in chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. It is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business, to put into the king's treasuries. So you see, he's very ambitious. He's got a plan. Now, this, of course, comes about because of what Mordecai is doing. He sees a way to get rid of both Mordecai. Well, he sees a way of getting rid of Mordecai. And I think part of the reason is suggested by the overall storyline here, that what's happening is you have people who want to consolidate their power. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more in just a minute. But what he's doing is he ends up stroking the king's ego and setting himself up as the only one that the king will entrust. He is ambitious. He wants to solidify his power. And now that he's in a place where he can do that and in a position with the king, he sets about doing that. And unfortunately for Mordecai becomes the stepping stone to that ambition. And Mordecai doesn't realize, and of course I'm not blaming Mordecai here when saying this, but Mordecai doesn't realize in refusing to bow down to Haman that he's helping to make this nightmare come true. Now, I think that this suggests what's happening here, that Haman is rather rich, and of course, along the way, if he's being promoted to second command, he probably is rich. Now, what's interesting is that he tells the king that I'm going to put 10,000 talents of silver of my own money into the king's treasury in order to take care of this people. Now, to remind you, I mean, a talent is a sum of money. It's not, it's not related to the word, our English word for talent, which means skill or a gift or whatever. But it's a measurement of precious metal, and here 10,000, a talent is, I've read, anywhere from 60 to 75 pounds. So, we're talking a lot of silver here. And from what I've read, 10,000 talents of silver is about 2/3 of the annual income of the entire empire during the reign of Ahasuerus. That means 15,000 talents of silver is collected from all over the empire during the reign of Ahasuerus. Would you like to have, 10,000 talents of silver? I mean, you multiply that times, we'll go with a lower number, 50 pounds. Would you like to have that much silver, in your coffers? Now, some scholars have asked whether or not this is really his actual money. Or is he thinking that what I'm going to do is, once I destroy the Jews, I'm going to confiscate all of their silver and whatever else they might have, and then he'll put it in. So he's actually promising 10,000. It's kind of giving a promissory note, an IOU in a way, and then he's going to put it, but he probably will put it back in because he doesn't want to go against the king. But he's a very powerful man now. He's second in command. Number 2. And the king commands everybody to bow down to him. Everybody. Bowing is always an act of submission. It's not part of our culture. It's part of other cultures in our world still today, that bowing does that. And even though somebody will bow back, the one doing the first bowing and the most submissive bows further than the other one does. But here, they're just bowing down to Haman to show their submission to him. And all of the king's servants are bowing. And I'm sure the nobles and the officials that are in the land, they have to bow down to him as well. It's not necessary in the narrative of who's ever writing Esther to talk about all the officials and everybody else, because he's focusing upon the fact that Haman's about to meet Mordecai, who refuses to bow down to him. And you see, Mordecai is at the gate every day. He was there when Esther was taken by the king's officials to become, to get into this beauty pageant to become the queen, and he's there every day worrying about her. And even though she becomes the queen, he's still there because he's worried about her. Even though she's not his biological daughter, he has raised her, and she has become his, and he is concerned about her. And because of that family kind of love comes up. So the only one who doesn't have to bow down to Haman is the king himself. And this story, it kind of parallels the the opening story where Ahasuerus is throwing the big party, and he, in his drunken stupor, sends a command for Vashti to come. And there's a lot of speculation as to what he wants when he says, I want Vashti to come and display her royal beauty. But she refuses. And of course, the wise men tell Ahasuerus, the king, that if you don't do something about this, then men everywhere will think that they can, women everywhere will think that they can disregard their husbands, and there'll be riot and rebellion on your hands. And so he gets rid of her, and replaces her. And Haman is thinking the same thing. If I don't do something about this Mordecai, that everybody then will start imitating him, and I'll lose my power, and I'll lose, the place that I have. And so this makes him. This now brings out the oppressive nature of him. Bow down to me, or you're going to die. See, he loves people bowing down to him. He loves, when he walks up there, everybody who's on the streets bowing down to him. That strokes his ego. Just as Ahasuerus' ego gets stroked on occasion, so Haman's is that just as well. But Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. He can't do, there's nothing he can do at the moment to do it. So he gets this idea, or he gets the idea from family to build. It's called the gallows in our translation, and that makes me think, of course, of the hanging that we did in our own country. But more than likely, it's an impaling kind of structure. It's said to be 50 cubits high, and some think that might be an exaggeration, because that would, stop and think about that. That's what, 75 feet in the air, and that's a rather large impaling stick, but maybe there's some kind of a structure and the impaling stick is on the top. And I've read too that sometimes actually people were executed before they were impaled, and the impaling was just so that they could be displayed publicly in order to incite fear in those who would see it. And it could be that he's thinking about impaling Mordecai publicly in order to show everybody, hey, I'm in charge. Here's what happens to you if you don't bow down to me. And all you Jews out there, I'm coming for you too. So he's out sending a message. So he's being as oppressive as possible. And so now the nightmare becomes real. And what happens, of course, is that Haman throws the dice, the purr, and creates a month and a day. And then he goes to Ahasuerus in chapter 3, verse 8, and says, there's a certain people that they need to be destroyed because they're not in your best interest. And he says, I'm going to put the money into the treasury so we can carry this out. And the king took a signet ring and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And right there, we, of course, are reminded of Haman's ancestral background. He is a descendant of King Agag, who's a king of the Amalekites, who attacked the Israelites back in Exodus chapter 17, just as they were coming out of Egypt and were in a vulnerable state. And then later on in Deuteronomy 25, even though they defeated the Amalekites, but not totally destroyed them, God promised that later on Israel would get their justice from them. And that's when he sent King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 15 to carry out that justice and said, here's how I want it done. When you do it God's way, then you are carrying out a righteous judgment. But Saul didn't do it that way. He let King Agag stay alive. And I'm assuming then he let members of Agag's family escape as well. And so, anyway, the king's scribes then, were summoned, and they wrote down this command, and they sent it throughout all the province. And of course, that's how, of course, this nightmare became very real to Mordecai and to then ultimately to Esther. And so Haman is out to destroy those who threaten his place, Mordecai and the Jews. Now, again, I started off by saying, this could be just another kingdom, just another promotion, just another rich and powerful man. But then again, that's the history of our world, isn't it? Countries attack other countries and bring nightmares into the lives of people that aren't part of, all of this. Think about some of the things, in a little bit of our history. Think about the Africans who were kidnapped, back in the 1600s. The people who lived in this new country, it wasn't the United States of America yet, but they created a market for buying slaves that were kidnapped. And so people kidnapped them and brought them to what later would become America, and slavery was formed. And think about the nightmare that the Africans had to go through, being kidnapped from their country, their homeland, and being brought over to the States and thrown into chains and beaten for not complying with the wishes of the people of this, who lived here. And then, of course, when we became a free country from England, freedom wasn't for everybody. Also think about when the Bolsheviks took over back in the early 1900s. And they formed the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they conquered all kinds of countries around them. And then the political power began, and the nightmare that they brought into the countries and people who dared to refuse to bow down like Mordecai did to Haman. But this is our world. And Esther shows that just when you think all is lost, when your nightmare is about to overwhelm you, you find that God has placed people and events to save the day. Your part in this world is to be faithful to what God has told us in His Word. And even if He doesn't seem to be bringing justice at the moment, He will one day. And so, yes, nightmare in Susa is nightmare in the world all over from the beginning of time, and will continue until Jesus comes back again. And yes, there will be times when God will bring justice and will bring in folks to save the day, but there are times when He doesn't. I don't know why that is, but God is good, and He one day will bring justice to the whole world. And Esther, though, reminds us that our God is powerful and gracious and good, and that's why we should continue to serve Him each and every day. So God bless.